So my name is Jamal Crawford, and organized this along with many other folks, some of the good folks at the ACLU, one of whom you'll be meeting in just a moment, Mr. Rahsaan Hall, who's the Executive Director of the Racial Justice Program at the ACLU. But I just want to kind of give you in a nutshell, how I came to this. It was actually Attorney Howard Friedman who was the first person to utter the word decertification to me. And after about a 20-minute phone call or so, I got off the phone and I did what any good researcher does, and I got on Google. And I began researching decertification, and it popped up all over the place. And there was a common thing that was emerging. It was emerging, and it was this name, Goldman. And so I once again Googled Professor Goldman, which brought me to his page at St. Louis University School of Law. And there was the picture and an email and a phone number. And I said, what the heck? Let me give him a call. Called him, left a message, figured maybe he might get back to me at some point, a couple weeks, months, maybe never. Called me 20 minutes later. And we had a great conversation. He got me up to speed on decertification. And it's just really common sense. And if you think about all the other professions that you interact with, from lawyers and doctors and so on and so forth, and even some professions where we might say, they don't carry such a burden and responsibility, like barbers or taxi drivers or such. And if they commit an offense that violates the sanctity of their profession, their license can be taken away from them. And that's what arrives us here at police. And as you can see from the materials, Massachusetts is one of only 6 states that doesn't have it. So it's just time for us to, get up to speed, get to common sense. And these folks tonight will let you know the whole breakdown on what decertification is, how it can be applied. And once again, thank you for coming. The next step of this is important because we're going to need all of you to continue to spread the word with your friends, spread the good word about decertification, and another term that you heard here tonight, POST. Peace Officer Standards and Training, because at the end of the day, it's an issue of professionalism and setting a professional standard. So once again, thanks for coming. We'll go on. Please, Rahsaan, come up here. We'll have the panel. We'll have Q&A. Please keep your questions brief. And also, too, we'd like to thank Representative Russell Holmes, who's here with us. We'll also be hearing more with his partner, Rep. Vieira, because they have legislation that's proposed together. We'd like to thank City Councilor Presley's office is in attendance as well, as is Senator Sonia Chang Diaz's office as well, and we expect more people coming along. All right, thank you, and I'll leave you with Rahsaan Hall, Executive Director of the Racial Justice Program at the ACLU. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamal. Good evening, everyone. It's certainly a pleasure to be here with you all to talk about this very important topic, this very important issue, and I think there could be no better time than now. The national conversation around police accountability is coming to a head, and as most of us know, the issues that are making this conversation so prevalent right now are nothing new. These are issues that particularly communities of color have been dealing with for generations, but fortunately there is a national conversation around it, and you'll hear from our featured speaker this evening, Professor Goldman, about his work and advocacy on this initiative to bring professionalization to the police practice, particularly here in Massachusetts. He's been advocating and doing this work for 35 years. And so with that, I will introduce Professor Goldman, and then he will give some remarks, and then after that I will come back to introduce the rest of our panelists. But briefly, as Jamal pointed out, we have Representative Vieira from the 3rd Barnstable District, Brigitt Keller from the National Police Accountability Project, Espinoza Madrigal from the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Economic Justice, and Attorney Howard Friedman. So Professor Roger Goldman is the Callis Family Professor of Law, Emeritus at St. Louis University School of Law, is the nation's foremost expert on police licensing and license revocation laws. For more than 2 decades, he has been helping states write and adopt laws that provide for removing license or certificate of an officer who engages in serious misconduct, such as sexual assault and brutality. When Professor Goldman began to address the problem of unfit Police officers moving from one department to another within states. 15 states were without the certification or revocation processes. Today, only 6 states remain without that revocation authority, and he is working with individuals like us here in Massachusetts to bring that to fruition. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you all Professor Roger Goldman.
Thanks, Rahsaan. It's great to be here. I thought I'd begin my remarks tonight, because you heard Rahsaan say I've been at this 35 years, and with a personal story. Why would I be doing the same thing for 35 years and making some headway? But let me tell you the story that got me first interested in this. Many years ago, Missouri, like my home state, like Massachusetts, had no procedure to prevent a police officer who was involved in serious misconduct in one department from going to another. I was chapter president of the ACLU at that time when this following incident occurred that was reported in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, so everything I'm telling you is really happened is reported in the Post. A small department in North St. Louis County, not too far from Ferguson, called Breckenridge Terrace, hired an officer named Joseph Sorbello. He'd been a lieutenant at the Maplewood Richmond Heights Department before he'd been hired by Breckenridge Terrace, and he'd been fired by that department. He was fired for several things. Just to give you an example of what kind of a lieutenant he was, he had an interesting way of getting confessions. And he would instruct his patrolmen on how to do it this way. First, he'd say, put a gun down the suspect's throat and say, suck on it. Pull out the gun, and sure enough, you'd get some confessions. If that didn't work, he'd say, handcuff the suspect and play Russian roulette and pull the trigger. And he did that in front of these 2 officers. The gun didn't go off, the person confessed. So several weeks later, 2 of the patrolmen that he worked with did play Russian roulette with a mentally challenged, handcuffed suspect, and the gun did go off, and the suspect was killed. The officers, of course, were criminally prosecuted, and they were asked, where did you get the idea that this is a way to get confessions? And they said, well, this is what Lieutenant Sorbello taught us. Not much of a defense, but the fact is that was true. So Sorbello was fired. He goes out to Breckenridge Terrace, this small department, and the chief knew that. He hired Sorbello despite that problem. Here's what he said. He was never found guilty of anything. Our policy here is that if the man comes to us qualified, we take it from there and make our own judgment. Now, why would a chief hire an officer who's known to be unfit? Remember the saying, it's the economy, stupid? Some of you may have remember that one. Well, first of all, it turns out there were budget constraints at that second department. And here's why Sorbello was an attractive candidate if you just put aside his problems at that first department. He completed his state-mandated academy training, about 600 hours. So he had his state certificate indicating that he was in good standing, because the state didn't have a decertification law then, just like Massachusetts today. So a chief of financially strapped department has the choice of, should I hire this guy who's got his mandated training, or should I hire a recruit? I have to put him through training, pay his salary while he's in training, wait 6 months before he can come to work for me. So you can see there's a temptation to say, well, let's give him another chance. There's a financial incentive. Secondly, Sorbello was not actually going to be that cost you that much, right? What other department's going to hire this guy? So if you are financially strapped, you're not going to have to pay him much money. Some of these departments pay no more than the minimum wage. So the cash poor department is able to hire him at a discount. And again, finally, the officer's available immediately. You don't have to wait 6 months before he goes through the academy. All right, so the lesson from this case of 35 years ago has stayed with me ever since. That is, the problem of unfit officers cannot be handled by the chiefs and the sheriffs alone. You have to have another level of government to be able to say, no, you cannot go to work for that second department. Well, soon after the events of Cervello, I had heard about Florida had a system of handling a case like this. And so I went to Florida. It was a grant from my university, and I hired a research assistant who had access to all the files of the first 7 years of officers who were decertified in Florida. And I should tell you that the motivation for Florida's law getting passed, some of you may remember the Liberty City riots in 1981 in Florida. It was occasioned by the death of an African-American insurance salesman on a motorcycle. He'd been shot by 5 Miami-Dade police officers. They were all tried for first-degree murder, they were all acquitted, and they all went back to work. And Florida, then, folks who drafted a bill on licensing and decertification had that bill ready to go, and it passed. Since then, Florida's decertified 7,000 police officers. Massachusetts has decertified 0. You don't decertify in this state. By the way, neither does New York, New Jersey, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and California and Hawaii. By the way, those 6 states that don't decertify have over 25% of all police officers in the country. So I went back to St. Louis with this information of Florida. And by the way, I found out that with my research, we had about 300 cases of decertified officers back at that time, from 76 to 83. And we divide them up into different categories of grounds for decertification. Corruption, like you say you're going to training, but you go to the Hialeah racetrack. But I was most interested in those that involved abuse of citizens. And of that subset of decertifications, about 100, the great majority of those decertifications were for sexual misconduct. Officer arrests, not always, but usually a woman, and they say, look, we know you've got a lot of points toward losing your license. I don't have to report this, but you have to agree to have sex with me. And there was one variation after another of that kind of sexual misconduct. And some of you may have seen a series of articles in the AP back in November, a 3-part series, that went through 1,000 decertifications from around the country of police officers decertified for that type of sexual misconduct. So anyway, I went back to town and had befriended the African-American head of internal affairs for the city of St. Louis. He later became chief and later became mayor, and we're very, very close friends. I got him to testify on a bill that I helped draft for in the legislature, and what he stated in front of the legislative committee that held a hearing was that in 90% of the cases where an officer had resigned under fire or been fired, that officer would be out in one of the 58 St. Louis municipal police departments, county municipal police departments, looking for a job and would often be hired. The legislature couldn't believe it. But again, in my experience, is what happened in Maplewood and Breckenridge Terrace, it was no surprise to me. So the law passed in '88, signed by Governor John Ashcroft, and since then, 700 officers have lost their licenses in Missouri. 0 in Massachusetts. So let me tell you what happens when you get an effective decertification law. So after we got the law passed, there were, some of you may know of Webster Groves, Missouri. It's a nice bedroom community. Jonathan Franzen, some of you may know, has written about growing up in Webster Groves. And what happened there was 3 officers, while on duty, were having sex with teenage girls in hot tubs. They were fired, but they were knowingly hired by neighboring departments. Why? They had a certificate. But the difference was, Missouri had a law of decertification. So, although these departments hired them, because of Missouri's law at the time said something like, you can lose your license for gross misconduct indicating an inability to be a peace officer. They had a hearing. The Administrative Hearing Commission said clearly that kind of conduct, sex on duty with teenage girls, is gross misconduct. And then the Department of Public Safety head is the one who imposes the punishment, and he decertified those officers, even though they had been fired from the second department. So that's what happens when you have the ability to revoke a license. Now, this gets to another problem, which I'm also working on at the federal level. What happens, 30,000 officers have been decertified since states began decertification. What happens to those officers who lose the license in one state and try to go to another? We don't really have an effective tracking system. Department of Justice it's been recommended, some of you may know about the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, that the DOJ get involved in this, in a national data bank to track where these officers are, and that's some discussion going on now in Washington whether to do it. So that's enough about St. Louis and my story and all that. Let me now turn to more generally. Where did this idea of having posts come from? Peace Officer Standards and Training Commission, as Jamal said. Some of you may remember the Kerner Commission report in 1967. It was set up after the deaths of Martin Luther King. And that Kerner Commission found two societies, one black, one white, and a lot of serious police abuse. That was the first time that it was recommended that all states enact a post and establish a Peace Officer Standards and Training Commission. Just as Jamal said, like other boards that regulate so many other professions and occupations. What the posts do is they set training, standards, they have selection standards, who should be able to be a police officer. They give a licensing exam, like a bar exam. They require continuing education, and they have, in those cases where there's serious misconduct, after a due process hearing, have the ability to revoke licenses. They don't just have to revoke, they can suspend, probate, whatever, just like other. So I think the takeaway for you should be is, we do this for so many other professions and occupations in this state. Why not do it for officers who have the power to arrest, search, and use deadly force? I mean, in fact, if you think about it, that's the one profession we ought to do it for. Why do it for accountants, architects, attorneys, and that's just the A's. Think about that. I mean, I don't know, Jamal, the total in this state, but it'd be worth, I'd say 100. So what do posts do? Here's the performance, here's what they do. First of all, they approve or run a basic training academy and have in-service annual training. They certify those training instructors and they certify the academies. And by the way, these are minimum standards. A department can go way above that, but these are minimum standards that you have. Secondly, to be eligible in the first place to be a recruit to go to the academy, a post would have selection standards built in. And I'll talk a little bit about that later, what they might be. They would then write and administer a standardized competency exam, like a bar exam. And finally, they would have the power to discipline the license up to revocation for serious misconduct after a due process hearing. So today, as Jamal said, 44 states have posts. Massachusetts is one of just 6 states that is not a post state. What Massachusetts does have is something called the Municipal Police Training Committee, or MPTC. That committee was established in 1964. It oversees the training of police officers. In basic, it's mandatory. The continuing is recommendation, but there are 40 hours of recommended continuing education training. Now, for the past 20 years, 3 different studies have recommended that Massachusetts establish a post. So the idea's been floating around, but I agree with Jamal. If we can't do this now, after Ferguson and Tamir Rice and McClellan McDonald and all those cases, I don't think we have another opportunity like this. So what would happen if Massachusetts became a post state? Well, it would establish selection standards, just like we have for many other professions. I'll give you an example of Florida's selection standards, which is, as you know, is a very active post state. In Florida, a person, before they could be eligible to become a law enforcement officer, would have to have not been convicted of a felony, not have been convicted of misdemeanor involving perjury, not have a dishonorable discharge from the armed forces, and the person must have a good moral character as determined by a background investigation. But here's what Massachusetts' current law is to be eligible to be a police officer in this state. I'm quoting here, "No person who has been convicted of a felony shall be appointed as a police officer of a city, town, or district." That's it. And by the way, notice it just says you can't be appointed. It doesn't say if once you're appointed you do commit a felony, that you have to give up your license. Now, I'm just telling you, that's not in the statute. And I'm not assuming anything. All it says is you can't be appointed. And then finally, of course, for Massachusetts to adopt post-legislation, officers would be subject to discipline like so many other professions in this state. Let me now give you some idea of the kind of misconduct that would lead to decertification. And I'm quoting from Arizona, a very active state in decertification. It has what's called an Arizona Post Integrity Bulletin, and it describes exactly the grounds for which the officer. So this is the latest publication for 2015. Here are just 4 examples. And by the way, in each case, there was decertification, and in each case, there was no criminal conviction. Here's the first one. The sergeant, while on duty, made inappropriate and highly offensive racially based comments to his co-workers. After they complained, he asked or pressured them to retract their complaints. Decertified. An officer used excessive force when he pushed a handcuffed subject backwards onto the ground. A video of the incident contradicted the officer's police report, showing the subject was walking, not resisting the officer, while being escorted to a police vehicle. This contradiction prevented the prosecution of the alleged crime. They didn't go forward with the crime, given the fact you've got an officer who lied. Third example, an officer assaulted a handcuffed prisoner who was confined in the rear passenger area of a police vehicle and submitted a police report, which was false concerning his justification for the use of force. Finally, an officer conducted a traffic stop on a woman who was impaired by alcohol. He was inappropriately complimentary and flirtatious with her. He made sexual advances and kissed her, among other sexual actions. He left her with her car with a warning not to drive. Several hours later, she contacted the department filing a complaint. And so every one of those officers were decertified. As I mentioned, that sexual misconduct is so common. I found that in Florida, and that AP report did the same thing. Now let me illustrate by an anecdote of an actual case in Massachusetts that I think will show you why Massachusetts needs this ability. This is a case out of Chicopee, Massachusetts. Several years ago, such an officer was fired for sexually harassing a female driver whom he arrested for driving on a suspended license. She was a licensed clinical social worker. The Civil Service Commission upheld his firing, so he was terminated. He appealed to civil service. They fired him. Now, since Massachusetts doesn't have decertification, if another police department wanted to hire him, I'm not saying they would, I'm just saying he would be eligible to be hired. Because remember, he was only terminated, he was not decertified because you don't have that in the state. So he could still be an officer in Massachusetts. He successfully completed the basic training, and he hasn't been convicted of a felony. Now, if the shoe were on the other foot, if the officer had been going to the social worker for counseling, and she did to him what he did to her, she'd have her license revoked. Because here's the language of the social work statute in Massachusetts. She would have either engaged in unprofessional conduct, or she had engaged in gross misconduct in the practice of her profession as a social worker. So again, it's a little ironic that he can't be decertified. He can get another job, but she can't. Now let me just tell you the 2 most important characteristics of an effective decertification law. First, a post ought to have ideally jurisdiction over all officers with police powers. Currently, the MPTC, remember, which just does training, only has jurisdiction over municipal, University of Massachusetts, and environmental police officers. It has no jurisdiction over deputy sheriffs, state police, other campus police, special or auxiliary police officers, or constables, all of whom have police powers in varying degrees. Most state posts have jurisdiction over all law enforcement officers. Many states, though, with elected sheriffs like Massachusetts, because their constitutional officers cannot be removed. You know, it's just a small slice of law enforcement. And you can see why it needs to be all officers, ideally, because if a state patrolman is fired for cause, or a deputy sheriff is involved in serious misconduct, he's not decertified, so he can get another job in law enforcement. So again, I think it's important when ultimately drafting a bill to include the broadest swath of law enforcement people possible. The second important part of a decertification law is it should not just be for conviction of a felony or specified misdemeanors. My guess is that in virtually every other profession, licensed profession or occupation in Massachusetts is like the social worker statute. Commission of serious misconduct, set forth in the statute after due process hearing, can result in revocation. Not conviction of, commission of. So in conclusion, my view is that Massachusetts ought to join the other states that do have decertification. As I mentioned, total of 30,000 officers nationwide have been decertified, but you can see that's really an undercount who should be decertified because you've already got 25% of all peace officers in the country working in these 6 states. They're not eligible. Plus, several of the states are limited to just conviction of rather than commission of. So to conclude, let me tell you that what keeps me up at night is knowing that there are plenty of Joseph Cerbellos still working as police officers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Goldman, for giving us the history of the post and some of the actual anecdotes that make this very real and relevant for us and the advocacy that many of us are engaged in. At this time, I'd like to give a little more of an introduction to our panelists this evening and then present them with several questions. First, we have, again, Representative David Vieira is the current member of the Massachusetts House of Representatives for the 3rd Barnstable District. He is also a Falmouth Town Meeting member and has been a moderator of that body since 98, and currently sits on the Public Safety Committee. Representative Vieira is also one of the lead sponsors on House 2192, which is a resolve to establish a commission to study the implementation of the post system here in Massachusetts. Brigitt Keller is the executive director of the National Police Accountability Project, which is a group of lawyers, law students, and legal workers dedicated to ending police abuse of authority through coordinated legal action, public education, and supports grassroots and victims organizations combating police misconduct. Yvonne Espinoza Madrigal is the executive director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Economic Justice. Prior to that, he was the litigation director for the Center for HIV Law and Policy. Yvonne has handled a wide range of civil rights issues, including racial justice, immigrant rights, and LGBTQ HIV equality issues. And finally, Attorney Howard Friedman is a well-known and prominent civil rights attorney here in the city of Boston, founding attorney of Howard Friedman, the law offices of Howard Friedman. Has been practicing for many years and almost exclusively handles police misconduct litigation. So let's give our panelists a round of applause. Being here this evening, Representative Vieira, I'd like to begin with you, as I know that there is a pending legislation. Could you please, for the benefit of the audience, describe what the resolve does and what the status of the resolve is?
Sure, thank you very much, and thank you for having me. I want to start by saying that for 13 years I served as a deputy sheriff in Barnstable County down on the Cape prior to becoming elected to the state legislature. And during that period of time, I had the opportunity to help write curriculum for the International Association of Chiefs of Police and the National Sheriff's Association. Those trainings were funded by the Federal Bureau of Justice Assistance. And during that period of time, after we write the curriculum, they would ask me occasionally to go out and be one of the trainers. And so I would go to the other 44 states in the United States to do the trainings because the required CEUs, the credentialing standards in those states made it so that police officers, deputy sheriffs, correctional officers had to attend various types of training. And so during this period of time, I was going all over the place implementing training, but not in Massachusetts. And so when I got elected to the legislature, I said, we got to do something about this. How do we get this going? And so the first term, you're a new legislator, and I was, because of my profession, I was appointed, I'm a Republican, I was appointed the ranking member of the Public Safety and Homeland Security Committee, which I still serve as ranking member. So the first term was sort of figuring out where are we with this? What are people thinking around post? And we found the 2010 report. I was elected in 2010, took office in 2011. So Senator Timothy had just issued a report of a study of police training and said we should have a post system. During that period of time, 7 of our 14 sheriffs went from being county sheriffs to being state departments, still independently elected officers of the Commonwealth. But they went from county budgets and county departments to being state departments. And during that transfer, there was what was called the Section 22 Commission. And the Section 22 Commission was looking at operations of sheriff's departments. And at the end of that, one of the recommendations of the commission was there should be a post system in Massachusetts, and the sheriff's offices throughout the Commonwealth should be part of that standard post system. So that leads me to my second term, where we introduced the legislation that is currently pending now in the second session. That this session, Representative Holmes and I are primary sponsors and introduced this legislation together. We like to call it the pathway to post. Now I can sit down in my office, or Representative Holmes can sit in his office, and draft up some legislation that would bring post to a community near you. And as soon as we introduce that bill, one group that you forgot to talk to, or one group that you forgot to include in the dialogue, will begin to develop opposition to the bill. And so what the pathway to post does is it establishes a special commission, not to study whether or not we should have post. We've already done 2 studies. And the outcome of both of those studies was that we should move in this direction. But it's to bring a broad-based coalition of law enforcement officials and those that have stakeholding interests in law enforcement profession to develop the system and to write the legislation. And then to bring that legislation to the legislature with this broad-based stakeholder support to move the legislation forward. So in the last session, we had some opposition. I was told this will never happen because of the union, the police unions. Well, they were right. The police unions were against it last time, and so they all lobbied the committee, didn't want the bill released. And then the state police, because of Chapter 22C, the unique authority that the colonel of the state police has in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. The state police colonel was against it, the previous colonel, because of the feeling that there was an encroachment on his ability to set the standard within his department and to credential and de-credential within his department. Now again, as we discussed, this is broader than just one law enforcement agency, but our statutes specifically give that type of authority within the state police to the colonel of the state police. So we worked on building the coalitions. When we testified on this bill in this session, the 3 major police unions in Massachusetts sat with me at the table and testified in favor of the bill. The new colonel of the state police still needs some convincing. And the fact that the Section 22C powers would still be bestowed upon the colonel, but that these would be minimum standards that all police officers and law enforcement officials throughout the Commonwealth would have to have. And with credentialing comes de-credentialing or decertification. So in order to get the bill out of committee, which it just came out of committee 2 weeks ago, we exempted the 22C powers of the state police to move the bill forward, to try to get the vote in the House and the Senate, to put together the stakeholder coalition, to start drafting the specific legislation. So one of the things that I've learned in a short period of time that I've been there in the legislature is that when you try to sit in your office and draw on your personal experience alone, you naturally build opposition to moving a major initiative like this forward. And so that's why we have the pathway to post, which is to bring those stakeholders together. What I did is I actually took an intern from MIT 3 years ago and said, find every member of every post commission across the United States and give me a laundry list of all the different entities that are on the actual post commissions. We took that laundry list and we made it comparable to those positions within the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And then we reached out and added them into the special commission to help develop the legislation. And so we've got between now and the end of July where the legislation will be in a formal session. So for those of you that are advocates for post and for decertification, I urge you to reach out to your reps, your senators, your friends, reps and senators, to make some more noise on Beacon Hill around this issue so that we can get this bill now that it's out of committee, which is a major hurdle, get it to the floor so that we can impanel the special commission and actually bring post to a community near you.
Thank you, Representative Vieira. Yes. And thank you also for the background as well, and acknowledging that there was a prior commission that issued a study. And to your point, when you answered my next question is what can the advocates do? And so reaching out to our elected officials and legislators is certainly a key component. And just a point of information, in the hallway as you all are leaving, there are some clipboards with postcards that you can fill out your name and address, and the ACLU can help you find who your elected official is, and we can send that off, which is asking them to move forward with post legislation. Another question that I do have, Representative Vieira, is what is the pathway to post? Calling the elected officials is one thing, but for the edification of us all, what needs to happen in order for this commission, for the resolve to be approved and for the commission, special commission to be created?
So the bill was released from committee as ought to pass. And what we're waiting now is, because a few thousand bills just had to meet the deadline for committee reports. We're waiting to see whether or not the bill is going to directly reside with the clerk's office to go for the orders of the day in an upcoming House session, because it's a House bill, so it will initiate in the House, or if it will be referred to House Ways and Means. So we're waiting for that final determination. If it is referred to House Ways and Means, then we'll be asking for folks to advocate with the Ways and Means members, particularly Chairman Dempsey, to release the bill from Ways and Means so that we can get it in the orders of the day on the House floor. If it is going to be sent to the calendar for the House debate, then what we'll need to do is we'll need to be advocating with the Speaker's office and the leadership to make sure that it comes up for an actual vote on the floor. So we're waiting right now to see what the final referral is. It will be on the House side of the shop. Once we get it pinned down, then that's where we'll put our energies Wednesday morning on meeting with the speakers.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let us know how we can be helpful. Howard Friedman. Now, you've been practicing law for quite some time and handling a wide variety of police misconduct cases. So Professor Goldman gave a couple of anecdotes of things that have happened in other jurisdictions, but I think one of the things that may stand in the way of people being convinced that this is something that needs to be in Massachusetts is the absence, or at least what we think is the absence, of those compelling stories that demonstrate or highlight why post is so necessary. So from your from the annals of your legal files, to the extent you can share, are there some anecdotes or some stories that you can give us that make it clear why post is necessary?
Sure, I can tell you, years ago I actually had a complaint. My client was a Boston police officer complaining about a state police officer. And the state police internal affairs investigation decided that they were going to sustain the complaint, but they didn't. Instead, what they said was they were going to refer it to the DA, and if the DA prosecuted and the officer was convicted, they were going to discipline that officer. My client, of course, being a Boston police officer, wanted the guy to be disciplined. He didn't want to see him convicted of a crime. He didn't want him to be fired from his job. But so what happened was nothing. Nothing happened to that state police officer at all. I represent Michael Bryan, who was the second victim, at least, of Boston police officer David Williams. He's pretty famous because he was fired by the Boston Police Department for his participation in the Michael Cox case. He's the one officer who got his job back. A few years go by, he's back in uniform, back on the street, and used excessive force on Michael Bryan, choked him. The department ultimately decided to fire him. He appealed, and the arbitrator decided that he believed David Williams, giving him his job back. It's on appeal now, but I think we can say that he's probably going to get his job back. Now, perhaps if there was a way to decertify him, he would be gone. If he has to get his job back, I think the City of Boston Police Department will end up having to negotiate a very, very generous golden parachute to pay him not to work, because if he goes out and does something to someone else, they'll have to pay that person for the injuries, and it's pretty likely there will be injuries. Now, there's one case that's sort of more hopeful. We actually represented a young man in a case against a Somerville police officer, Officer Freitas. And, we settled this case, and I told him, I know you wanted the officer to be disciplined, but that just doesn't happen. It's not going to happen as a result of a civil case. And it never really does. Except in his case it did, because Officer Freitas had gone to Austin, Texas, and wanted to be a police officer there. And before his lie detector test, he admitted to some things like he was creative in his police report sometimes, didn't really tell the whole truth. And there was that one time when he had some marijuana and he gave it to a friend instead of disposing of it through the department. The department actually gave him minor discipline, they were going to keep him. Then in our case, we had the records. I don't know what he was thinking, but in his deposition, he told yet another story about the marijuana. He said, no, he didn't give it to anyone else. That would be distribution. He just threw it into his backyard. Well, I guess the Seminole powers that be had finally gotten tired of this officer, and they decided to terminate him for lying. And what's great about it is that the Civil Service Commission affirmed, and what they said is, for decades, the Commission has steadfastly upheld disciplinary action against public employees who have been untruthful, including law enforcement officials who have fudged the truth. So when they say, we can't discipline, no one will hold it up. Now, arbitrators may be a slightly more favorable form for police, but they can be disciplined. It requires police agencies, though, really wanting to push it and prove that the officer has lied. And that's one of the big problems we have is they know one another, they may like the person may have friends and relatives on the force, so the power isn't there. But if there's an independent agency to say, well, no, this conduct is such that you no longer are licensed. You can't be like a lawyer, they can hold our ticket. Well, why shouldn't they do that to police officers so we don't have people like David Williams continually violating the civil rights of citizens?
Thank you. Thank you for bringing those real-life examples to bear. Professor Goldman, I want to follow up with that. In the case of David Williams and our reference where an individual had been accused of misconduct on several occasions, but the Civil Service Commission that deals with kind of due process in hirings and terminations, it reinstated that individual's job. How would that work if there were a post system in place?
So this has come up in many other states with post systems. And I should tell you that there's a range of answers to it. So let's take the state of Washington. In the state of Washington, if the chief fires, but then an arbitrator or civil service commission overturns the fire, that officer, for any reason, that officer goes back on the job, probably with back pay. In other words, which seems kind of strange because what you're saying is the decision to hire or fire prevents a decision to remove a license. So that in other states, Arizona for example, whatever the local department does, say fire, an arbitrator reverses, that's only a question of should the person be fired or not. That's a decision of employment. But the decision on whether to keep your license is completely independent. So in Arizona, the Post Commission can make its own determination. It's not, to use a legal term, stopped in any way from what that local commission does, from what the state local agency does. Florida splits the difference. In Florida, if the arbitrator overturns the firing on grounds that the officer never committed the misconduct in the first place, then the state commission is bound. If the arbitrator decides he did commit it, but let's say the decision is, well, in the past the chief for that kind of conduct only suspended for a week, that's unfair treatment, and therefore the penalty should not be termination. And in that case, the post can say he was found to have committed the sexual misconduct, the perjury, whatever it is, and he loses your license. So I know it's a complicated answer, but I guess what I'm urging is, I'd like to be here, Rep. Vieira, when you all get into the weeds like that, because I think the decision to license, to remove a license, is completely separate from the question of whether you should be terminated or not.
Yeah, thank you. And to that last point you made about getting into the weeds and the advocacy that needs to happen, I think it's worth noting that we have in the executive director of the MPTC which Professor Goldman mentioned, the Municipal Police Training Committee, Dan Zivkovich, who is one of the ranking members of IADLS, okay. So, Professor Goldman, can you explain a little bit about what that organization is and why it's significant that Dan Zivkovich is in that role?
Right, so the heads of all of these 44 state posts, plus the 6 heads of the states, like Massachusetts, that only have a training academy, those 50 executive directors have belonged to an organization called IADLS. It's a mouthful. That's an acronym for International Association of Directors of Law Enforcement Standards and Training. So they have annual meetings. I just came from DC when they were all meeting with the Department of Justice. So these are the equivalent of all the heads of the state bar, State Medical Association got together. Well, Dan Zivkovich in this state is the president-elect of that organization. He is so respected nationally. I come to their meetings very often. He is incredibly impressive. You are very lucky in the state to have someone with that talent.
Great, thank you. Howard, I want to come back to you briefly, and I'm just curious if you know offhand, have you ever had an instance where a police officer that was involved in a case of misconduct was also charged and prosecuted?
I have. No, in fact, there is a case of Boston police officer Joe Lamore and his colleague Joe Polito. Joe Lamore had sued him, and when he got on the force, he had a lot of complaints. He stopped getting complaints, was promoted to a sergeant. And as a sergeant, he said, we'll take his word, my client drove by the police station, and while speeding, he also stuck out his middle finger and made some unkind comments about the police. He then got in the car, and he said he just got it out very gently and no problem at all, although unfortunately for him, it was late at night and the restaurant manager was returning from his job, looked out the window, and he saw Joe Lamore kicking a restrained prisoner. Lamore was surprised because IA decided to discipline him. So he needed some witnesses for the IA hearing. He got his colleague, patrolman, Polito, to find some of his friends to come in and lie. Just plain out lie. And they did. He wasn't going to be disciplined. He would have got minor discipline, except for the fact I filed a civil rights suit. And then the Justice Department started looking into it, and the FBI came knocking. The people who were lying, 2 out of the 3 immediately said, oh my God, I feel so terrible, I lied in those depositions. Lamore and Polito were convicted of suborning perjury, and Lamore was convicted of perjury when he said he didn't beat up my client. So Lamore was sentenced to 4 years in prison, Polito 3. And there's some sympathy. Poor Polito was a young patrol officer doing what his respected sergeant told him to do, which is a little bit like the story Roger said, where the leader is the one who's telling you to do things that are improper. So, convicted of perjury, I would hope he wouldn't be able to work anywhere, right? I mean, because at least any police department would do a criminal records check, hopefully in every place you've ever lived, and that would show up. So, it does happen.
And so what's ironic about this is you described that had it gone forward with the regular disciplinary process, he might not have received that significant level of...
Oh, he was going to be, I think, reduced in rank for a year and suspended for a short period of time. So even though the department, in his view, was like teaming up against him, actually the discipline would have been relatively mild because they hadn't put it together that the witnesses were lying. And if you want me to tell a story, I'll tell you that I sort of figured it out because one of the witnesses worked as a bouncer in a nightclub. The incident took place early Sunday morning. And seemed like that would be when a bouncer would probably be working. And he said he took this route, he said he was actually on the North Shore, he was driving through East Boston. It didn't make any sense. So we subpoenaed his employment records, bingo, he was working as a bouncer downtown. So right away we knew this guy was lying. Now, did IA do that? No. So, and that tells you, the difference between someone who is interested in finding out the truth and people who are just processing it through and would hope that they don't find any lies, right? They're not really looking for it, and if you don't look for it, you're not going to find it.
And so, because there's a criminal conviction there, those officers could potentially be precluded from being hired as police in other departments, other jurisdictions. But the underlying conduct that they were lying about wasn't anything that would prohibit them from being hired as police officers in any other jurisdiction if they were just by chance let go from that department.
The cover-up was much worse than the crime.
There it
Absolutely.
is. That's always the case. Thank you. Brigitt, I'd like to turn to you now, and I'd like you to explain the National Police Accountability Project and why police accountability is so important.
The National Police Accountability Project is a project of the National Lawyers Guild and was founded in 1999 by a group of attorneys, civil rights attorneys within the Guild, who felt that police misconduct and brutality was so prevalent that it was warranted to have a project to address that issue. And so NPP is a membership organization of legal professionals and law students who sue police and corrections for civil rights violations. And as an organization, NPP, we are providing support services to the attorneys. We have a very active listserv for the attorneys, discuss litigation strategy, etc. We are, as an organization, we are supporting advocacy efforts, legislative initiatives. We regularly submit amicus briefs to federal courts, educating judges about the importance of police accountability. We provide know your rights trainings, and we go out to information events like this one. And why is police accountability so important? I mean, there are many reasons for that, and one reason there's the saying that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I think there is a lot of wisdom in this saying, and I think that we need to. Police are very powerful. And we need to put a check to this power, and we need to hold police officers and departments accountable for their actions. And I want to add one thing. Police misconduct, and this may not be so obvious to many people because they do not experience police misconduct as much as other people, communities of color. And so we really need to recognize that police misconduct is extremely destructive to individuals, obviously, who are victims of police misconduct. It's extremely destructive to families and to entire communities. And so accountability is very, very important.
Thank you. It reminds me of the notion that an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So even though, like you said, it may not impact certain individuals directly, it still has a ripple effect in larger communities. One of the things Professor Goldman mentioned early on in this talk was the number of sexual assaults and sexual misconduct that officers who have been decertified and licensed are involved in. Could you speak a little bit about why that is a significant issue, and if you could or are willing to bring your own perspective as a woman to that issue?
Samuel Walker is a professor emeritus at the University of Nebraska and one of the leading researchers on police misconduct, and he actually coined the phrase driving while female. And he did this in the early 2000s, and for many reasons, it didn't really get much at that time. The topic didn't really get that much traction. And I believe there are many reasons for that. And it's really two big problems: police misconduct and sexual misconduct come together. And our society and other societies don't really like to talk about neither. People don't want to talk about police misconduct, and people don't want to talk about sexual violence. And in both, on both topics, we often see that that victims are blamed for the violation of their right. We see this in police misconduct cases, and we see it in sexual violence cases. And also, you can imagine that victims of police misconduct are often in a vulnerable position, and because, for example, they're stopped at night for a traffic violation, they're most often alone, and they have to, if they file a complaint, their recollection of the event is often discredited because society is much more willing to believe that a police officer is actually telling the truth, as opposed to somebody who might have been driving drunk or who might have had a suspended license, etc. And so for a long time, it wasn't really that much in the public eye, sexual violence by cops. And in 2015 and 2016, Al Jazeera America and Associated Press researched the topic, and both newspapers presented long articles about the issue. And I think it was AP who said that within 6 years, 1,000 officers' licenses were revoked for sexual misconduct, and Roger already mentioned this. But obviously, this is really just the tip of the iceberg, because many victims of sexual misconduct by police officers are not willing to come forward because they know that their account will be discredited, and that very often women tell us that, if they got a lawyer and started a case against an officer, that their history, everybody is poking around with their history and is bringing up relationships they had, etc., to really discredit their story of police sexual violence.
Thank you. It certainly brings to mind the recent case that grabbed national headlines, the officer who was charged and convicted of rape in Oklahoma. So it's very prevalent. Professor Goldman, earlier we spent some time together and you talked about kind of these vulnerable populations and analogized it from having recently seen the spotlight. Could you say a little more about how that is significant in the vulnerable populations?
Let me answer your question by referring to the case you just mentioned and Brigitt was talking about too. This fellow, Daniel Holtzclaw, was convicted and sentenced to, I think, 250 years for 8 different rapes. And the first 7 were women, just as Brigitt said, and just as Rahsaan's getting at. The women didn't go forward, and even those who did go forward were very vulnerable populations. They tended to be, in some cases, prostitutes, in some cases, runaways, low-level drug offenders. And so the connection to Spotlight, and I'm sure most of you have seen it, with priests, there's this tendency, who could we do something with who would be disbelieved? And it wasn't until, I think, a middle-class African-American woman who was a grandmother, who had none of the characteristics that we normally think of as I was mentioning, prostitutes and so forth. And she was the first person who was believed. Again, just as in the priest problem, you go after the boys who nobody would believe, they're troubled, whatever. So I don't know. There's this sense that this is the kind of person that I can get away with it. And thank God for that grandmother, because I don't think there would have been prosecution but for that.
Thank you. So, and I think there's a lot of the national conversation around police accountability centers around a lot of kind of highly identifiable populations. We see the birth of Black Lives Matter, people advocating because Black people have overwhelmingly been victims of police brutality and police misconduct. And certainly, as you heard, there are a large number of sexual assault cases that officers are involved in police misconduct. But there is also another large population that gets overlooked in the conversation of police accountability, or excuse me, police misconduct and police assaults. And Yvonne, when you first joined the Lawyers Committee, one of the conversations we would have around concerns of police justice and police accountability was the type of police practices that were happening. And one of the refrains that you would continue to come back to is this notion of walking while trans. And so the LGBTQ community, the level of abuse and misconduct that they're subjected to by the police, I think, gets overlooked. Could you talk a little bit more about why that is and what are some of the concerns there?
Yeah, and I think it's great that we are connecting the dots here between this type of police misconduct and vulnerable populations, because I think that's really key, and I really appreciate the parallel to Spotlight, because throughout this conversation, that's what I kept thinking about, is that we have a police culture of targeting individuals who are more vulnerable, who are at intersections of vulnerability in particular. And I think, as some of my colleagues here have explained, this often plays out with women, it often plays out with minority communities, right, in low-income neighborhoods. And it also happens with other minorities, like trans women or other LGBT and queer individuals who are either perceived as being more vulnerable and less likely to exercise their rights and to come forward to ask for relief and protection. And so I think it's really important that we hone in on that, right? As we keep talking about all of these states that have these protections and how few states don't, right? Who bears the brunt of that abuse? Who bears the brunt of that misconduct? And who bears the brunt of that violence? And I think it's critical for us to think about the vulnerable individuals, like you're saying, Rahsaan, people who are being stopped by police, even just for walking while trans, or because their gender identity is not in conformity with their names, and how that triggers heightened police scrutiny or heightened policing. And so I think this is a really important point to be making here, because it continues to exacerbate the vulnerabilities that these populations already face, the barriers that these vulnerable individuals already have to overcome to come forward for protection and relief. So it exacerbates their public safety problem. And of course, it also creates a problem that I think was mentioned earlier by other folks in terms of the liability prospects that come from allowing these individuals to remain on the street, targeting particularly vulnerable individuals. And so I think this duo, the public safety and the liability, this fiscal, the use of taxpayer money to solve these problems in the back end, really militates strongly in favor of having the type of system that we're talking about here today, and making sure that it very robustly protects the vulnerable individuals who are really more likely to face this type of police-targeted or violence visited in those communities. And I think that often they're along the lines of what we've been talking about already, not just gender, but certainly race and class and sexual orientation and gender identity. And so it's important for us not to forget or to lose sight of the fact that the vulnerabilities also extend into sexual orientation and gender identity, because cops have been known to target these individuals, not just here in Boston, but in communities around the country. So it's something we have to be looking out for as we have this conversation.
Thank you. And so that raises in my mind this notion of training. And so before we can de-license or decertify any officers, there has to be a certain level of, a certain standard that the officers are being held to. Professor Goldman, from your experience in working with Post, how does the Post system really help that and maintain that? And what could that potentially look like here in Massachusetts?
Currently in Massachusetts, I mentioned that the basic training is mandatory, but if you've been trained 15 years ago, what do you know about dealing with persons that are mentally ill, implicit bias, sexual harassment, a whole lot of other fairly new topics, and that has to be mandated through CUs, continuing education. In Massachusetts, currently, these are recommended. But in a post state, you absolutely have to, as a condition for keeping. You can lose your license if you don't keep up with that mandated training. And I think it's crucial, given everything we know that's been happening lately, that it isn't enough just that you have mandatory basic training. You have to keep that training going because, and that to me is a given. By the way, one state is actually in worse shape than Massachusetts. In Hawaii, there's not even any mandatory basic training. It's up to each department. So I guess that's some good news. At least you do that.
That's pretty disturbing. So we're going to get to questions soon, but Yvonne, I wanted to come back to you because another thing that I thought of is a recent case that the Lawyers Committee got involved in involving the Brookline Police Department. And so there were some concerns there about officers and their treatment by other officers. Could you talk about a little bit about what that case, to the extent you can, what that case is about, and how a post system could potentially impact that?
It's also interesting. I know that Howard has already shared a lot of examples, but as we've been talking about this, I've just been thinking about some of these more recent examples. One of the things that the professor said is that I believe it was in Arizona or in one of the other states, there was some allegation of racism, and that led to the decertification of one of the police officers, if I'm not misquoting the professor. Well, if we had that type of seriously, because, and it's not just in Brookline where we do have one of these cases where there are very strong allegations of racism happening with superior officers and the way they're interacting with their own peers. And when you think about it, right, if that's the way they're treating their own cohort, how are they treating some of the individuals, the populations we've been talking about? How are they interfacing with a trans woman of color on the street? Or how are they interfacing with people while they're driving while black, right? And so it's really concerning because I think that the way you treat your own colleagues, if you can't even treat them with a modicum of respect, now imagine how that translates to the way you're interfacing with the public. And in Brookline, we have a case where we are suing the Brookline Police Department for racial discrimination. We're suing on behalf of 2 police officers. And we have other instances, even here in Boston, where we are suing because the police departments have failed to follow what we think are just very simple best practices in terms of make sure that you are not discriminating against persons, right? That you are disciplining people when they say the N-word in the workplace, right? Like basic standards. And what we find, and this isn't rare, this is commonplace, is that the police is constantly just ignoring these incidents, right? There was a case just last week. It's not one of ours, it's not the Lawyers Committee, but it made the Globe, and it's a case involving Nicholas Cox. And he sued not just the city of Boston, but 3 police officers. One of them had 16 complaints filed against them. The other one, 10 complaints. And when, in the middle of a deposition, they asked one of the police officers, have you ever been asked to change your behavior in any way by any supervisor at any time while you were a police officer? I mean, after 16 complaints, the answer, no. Right, and so then it just, to me, this conversation about what are the standards that we need to have to decertify police also is a conversation that we need to have about what are the standards that we are implementing for training and for making sure that the people who we are putting out on the street to police our children, to police our wives, our husbands, the people who live with us, right? Who is out there and how are we holding them accountable is critical. And there are so many examples that were given earlier, like the racism that should be not just fireable offenses, but that should be disciplined. And so this type of reform is something that benefits many, many different vulnerable communities across the board, and it just is critical for accountability and transparency in policing.
Thank you, Professor Goldman. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, I wanted to... Is this on? Yeah. Two things come to mind with your comment. I was working with ACLU in New Jersey, helping the executive director come up with an op-ed piece for the Newark Star-Ledger. And she wrote an article, basically what I said tonight, recommending decertification. And the next day the office was flooded with calls. And the calls were coming from women police officers, not from people in the street. They were getting sexually harassed by their sergeants, and they, of course, didn't report because they were new to the job. Second point, vulnerable populations. The most moving, sad story I ever heard. I was on a commission that was set up by the IACP, International Association of Chiefs of Police, to look into sexual offenses by police. And each of us went around the room, and I was there because I'd been advocating decertification. But the most moving one, this is Brigitt, you may know this person, she's head of an organization in New York called GEMS. They work with girls who are prostituted, 13-year-old girls. And each year she asks her 300 girls, they have a residential training place to live and training. What's been your experience with police? 90% of the girls said we've been raped by police. The most vulnerable you can imagine. Young, prostitute, and that absolute power is absolutely right.
Well, that's sobering, though. Representative Vieira, I wanted to ask you one last question. I mean, because a lot of what we've talked about and what we've heard from the panelists seems to have not necessarily, or seems to have what could be perceived as an anti-police slant. I think it's a given that it's more about lifting up the stories of the trespasses for a greater concern around accountability. You've been able to work with some law enforcement officials that seem supportive of that. How have you been able to do that, and what are the prospects of continuing to keep law enforcement engaged in this process with you, particularly when there is this level of concern within communities? How do you strike that balance?
You know, I think the irony of it is that where we are now in sort of the national dialogue around this issue, I think is what has really brought more of the law enforcement profession to the table. Because those that are doing what is right, or working their hardest to do what is right, want to maintain the integrity of their profession, and maintain the integrity of their colleagues in that profession. And so, as in any profession, there are some bad apples. And I think that we're at a point in time that the reason why a lot of the law enforcement entities have come to the table with this is because they want to make sure that the training necessary to do it right is in place. And they want to make sure that those that aren't doing what they're supposed to do are held accountable for that. And I think that's so important. Now for me, I lead with the training, the building capacity. I'm kind of a strength-based model kind of guy. You know, I like to look at what is good of the 90-some-odd% of folks that are doing what they're supposed to do, and then figure out why is that other smaller percentage not doing what they're supposed to do, and is that something that we can train, or is it something that we have to use de-credentialing to get them out of the profession? And so as long as I think the coalitions that we're building continue to focus on the honorable profession of upholding our constitutional rights and our civil rights, that we find those that are in violation of that principle, and we alienate them from their profession, and quite frankly, we alienate them from society. That they have rights themselves, but when they are the caretakers, and they are the gatekeepers to our civil liberties. They must be held. And myself included for the 13 years that I wore the badge. We must be held to the highest standard. We are not clipping hair. Not that there's anything wrong with that profession, but we're not clipping hair and then being told you did it wrong, you can no longer do this profession. We are controlling folks' access to liberty under the Constitution. And that is the highest power in our society.
Thank you. Professor Goldman, you wanted to add to that?
I began this work, as I told you, when I was president of the ACLU, and I worked with civil libertarians, folks sitting around this table. But in the last 30 years, my allies in all this have been police professionals, people like Dan Sivkovich. And they have to take a leadership role, and I think they will.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give our panelists a round of applause.
I would just briefly mention, Dan actually came from a post-state, so he has been an ally and an advocate all along.
Yeah, he's been great. I want to acknowledge Senator Sanchez Diaz, who has joined us. Thank you for being here this evening.